Torah trivia. In what two places in the Torah do animals speak to human beings? In human language, like that the human being can understand. In what two places in the Torah do animals speak to human beings? You might be thinking of them in your mind. One, I'll give you a clue, comes from this week's Torah portion. So I will share with you the answers because we're not calling out. But I know you have it right anyway. The first one is in this week's Torah portion in Bereshit, when we find the serpent or snake speaking to Eve, right? Telling her, oh, that tree, you can eat from it, it's okay. You're not going to die. You're just going to, know more than you did before. You're going to be a little bit more like God. So that's the first time. The second time comes much later in the Torah, in the book of Numbers in the Torah portion Balak, where the prophet Balaam is riding on his donkey and he's out to curse the Israelites under the order of King Balak, but he can't do it. And the donkey is not following his directions, and so he's hitting the donkey. And finally, she opens her mouth and says, what are you doing? Like, am I not your donkey that you've traveled on all this time? And am I now, And so at that moment, the donkey speaks to Balaam in the same way that the snake spoke to Eve in language that was human language that they could understand. What each of those animals was doing in speaking to the human being was awakening them to something that they couldn't perceive or didn't know or didn't have an understanding about. And so in some ways, the animals in those cases had the upper hand, or at least the greater knowledge. But surely these biblical stories of the snake and donkey are made up to capture the reader's attention, to entertain, to teach lessons. I, for one, don't believe that they're true. And so I've been thinking this week about the relationship that human beings have with animals. In the first chapter of Bereshit, and on the sixth day of creation, when human beings were created, God said, just at the moment before, let us make a human being in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the year due. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And then the human beings are created. And God gives them their first commandments. God says, be fertile and increase, also known as be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and master it. Urdu and rule. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. One of the first commandments that human beings are given is to rule over the animals. And the word that's used is Urdu. When God was thinking of making the human beings, the same shoresh, the same root, Vayirdu, Urdu. And we see this twice in relationship to human beings and animals. According to the medieval French commentator Rashi, this expression, Urdu, may imply dominion, right? Having dominion, as well as descending, because the shoresh, the root of the word is yarad, going down. So it could be descending. So if a person is worthy, then that person will dominate over the beasts and cattle. But if the person is not worthy, then the person will sink lower than them, and the beast will rule over the person. Interesting midrash on that take of Urdu. According to this creation story that we read, we as people have dominion over animals. But dominion comes with responsibility. Another piece of Torah trivia, the Torah has more laws regarding animals than it does commandments about Shabbat. Judaism recognizes that we use animals. We use animals for labor. We use animals for food. And we use animals for other things that benefit us as human beings. So Judaism also guides us in each of these areas to carry out our dominion with compassion. Using animals for labor. Ancient accounts remind us that we've used animals for labor and transportation going back thousands of years. Think of oxen plowing fields and caravans of camels carrying people as well as their possessions. The Torah teaches that when one plows one's field, one must not do so with an ox and donkey on the same yoke, harnessed together. An unequal strength of these two different kinds of animals would cause stress, physical or otherwise, for either animal. The Torah also forbids muzzling an ox while it's working in the field. Just think, it's so cruel if you put a muzzle on the ox, and where is its sight and its smell and its mouth is right hovering over what would be its food, smelling it, seeing it, but not being able to taste it. And this is all while it's working and it's getting tired, and it might need some of that nourishment. So the Torah teaches us, don't muzzle an ox while it's working, so that it can have the food that will give it nourishment to continue working. In addition to these working accommodations, the Torah also recognizes that animals need to rest. We look at the 10 Commandments, and we see in the mitzvah for Shabbat, our day of rest, our animals are also supposed to rest. It says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath to the eternal your God. You shall not do any of work, you, nor your son or daughter, your male slave or your female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is in your settlements. So we need to give our animals, back as far as the 10 Commandments, that kind of rest that we are giving ourselves. And these are just a few of the responses in the Torah as to how we treat animals with regard to labor. Central to these texts is an expression of compassion toward animals, and what has become known as the Jewish value of Sa'ar Ba'alei Chaim, the prohibition of cruelty or causing unnecessary suffering to animals. We also use animals for food. Judaism acknowledges that human beings use animals for food. Some people are vegetarians and some people are vegan. But if we're looking back in the Torah, we see that that people have been eating. Look at the whole sacrificial practice and ritual. Some of that food was to go to the Kohen as that payment for officiating at the sacrifice. We also use animal products, whether it's milk or eggs or consuming the animal itself. Rabbi Abraham Twersky talks about love of fish. Young man, why are you eating that fish? The young man says, because I love fish. He says, oh, you love fish? That's why you took it out of the water and killed it and boiled it? He says, don't tell me you love the fish, you love yourself. And because the fish tastes good to you, therefore you took it out of the water and killed it and boiled it. Rabbi Twersky uses this example to teach a lesson about love. When we love, we give to the other. In the case of fish love, we're only taking for ourselves. In the Torah, we see different examples of expressing care, even in the situations in which we plan on eating the animal. One such example is, do not boil a kid goat in its mother's milk. While this commandment has evolved into the separation of milk and meat dishes in the same meal, the verse at its very core is about avoiding cruel behavior. Another example warns us that if we see a mother bird sitting on a nest, whether it's on eggs or her fledglings, don't take both the mother and the young, or the eggs. What we should do is shoo away the mother bird and then only take the eggs or fledgling, but not in her presence. I was always fascinated by this. The other thing that's interesting about this commandment is it's one of the ones that says, if you do this, you shall have long life. A biblical commentator known as Kli Yakar suggests that there's a connection between this law of how we treat the mother bird and the commandment of honoring parents. which is also followed by that tagline, if you honor your father and your mother, you may live a long life and live well. Kli Yakar sees that if we treat the mother bird with respect, that this kindness and this kind of behavior leads to our being respectful to our parents. So we're kind to the bird, we're respectful to the mother bird, that leads to our being respectful to our parents. Now, I mentioned some people are vegetarians or vegans and choose not to eat meat. I do. I eat meat, and it just so happens that I eat only kosher meat. And while this topic has debated, the Jewish ritual of slaughtering animals, known as shechita, is thought to be most humane because the animal feels the least, if any, amount of pain before it dies. The Jewish laws surrounding using animals for food keep in mind this balance of dominion and compassion. And using animals for other benefits. We use animals to benefit any number of needs as human beings. We shear sheep and use the wool for making clothing. We also use animal hides and sometimes furs for clothing, accessories, furniture, equipment, and more. I often think of Native Americans and their use of animals when they've killed them. They make use of the entire animal for food, shelter, tools, etc., and it's a model to follow. We also benefit from animals when we conduct necessary medical experiments on animals. And the word necessary is italicized, though you can't see it from where you are. When it comes to pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, that's the highest Jewish value, human health and healing, those are of the highest importance. 16th century Polish codifier of Jewish law by the name of Rabbi Moses Isserlis, he states, whenever it's for the purpose of healing human beings, it's not a prohibition against Tsar Balei Chaim. It doesn't violate that don't be cruel unto animals. Dr. Avraham Steinberg has written a 3-volume encyclopedia of Jewish medical ethics. And among various guidelines on using animals for benefiting the human healing, he writes, whatever is needed to cure a sick patient, even one who's not dangerously ill, it doesn't violate the law against Tsar Balei Chaim. Another guide he encourages, it's preferable, if possible, to use lower forms of animals whenever possible. And this was interesting to learn because the pain and suffering is greater among higher forms of animals with better developed nervous systems. And another point he makes is one should use the fewest animals possible, consistent with the experimental needs. There's another way we use animals, as companions. There are service animals, there's emotional support animals, there's therapy animals, and simply pets. Think of the number of dogs, cats, and other animals that were adopted or bought or brought into people's homes during the pandemic, and how having those pets help the mental wellness of the adopting human being. Who rescued whom? Which makes a good segue for a commercial for Beth Emmett's Blessing of the Animals ceremony. So this year we are holding our Blessing of the Animals ceremony on Shabbat during Parashat Noach, which is next Saturday, October 9th at 4 p.m. And so if you have an animal, please feel free to bring your animal with you to our, I see Lee's putting it in his calendar right now, to the northern part of our parking lot, October 9th at 4 o'clock. And that's only going to be an in-person event. As we have made use of the companionship of our animals, we have this opportunity to express our gratitude to them and to God by participating in this blessing of the animals. Our Torah teaches us from the beginning of creation of human beings that we were made to have dominion over fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. But having dominion comes with responsibility. We acknowledge that animals are sentient beings. Jewish teachings point us to refrain from being cruel to animals as much as we are able and treat them with kindness and compassion. Kal v'chomer, all the more so, when we are kind to animals, may we be kind and compassionate to other human beings. Shabbat Shalom.